I had been looking forward to this trip for months. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that nothing beats the solitude of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I had been to several campsites out there before, but this one was different. It felt isolated, tucked away near a stretch of forest that seemed almost untouched. It was the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul, and when you set up camp, it felt like you had the whole world to yourself. I had made the drive up that morning, passing through towns that felt like they belonged in another era. By the time I arrived at the site, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, and the air was just starting to cool off. Perfect camping weather. I was car camping, so I didn't need to haul anything too heavy. I had a tent, a small stove, my sleeping bag, and some food. I was ready to kick back, have a couple of beers, and enjoy the peace and quiet that comes with being in the middle of nowhere. The campsite was fairly straightforward. A fire pit, a cleared out area for the tent, and a picnic table. I backed my car up to the spot, made sure it was level, and started unloading. As I set up the tent, I noticed how still everything was. The trees were thick with green leaves, but there wasn't a whisper of wind. The sound of the forest seemed muted, almost like it was holding its breath. The first sign that something was off came when I realized I couldn't find 2 of my tent stakes. I always double-check my gear before I leave, and I distinctly remembered packing everything. But when I reached into my bag, I was short 2 stakes. I checked the car. I checked the ground around my tent. No stakes. I even checked the backseat of my car just in case I'd tossed them in there at the last minute, but they weren't there either. I swore under my breath. I wasn't in the mood for this. The sun was dipping lower, and I still had to get everything set up before night fell. I rummaged around my trunk, hoping I could find something to use as a substitute, anything that could hold the tent down. I managed to find a couple of long branches and fashioned makeshift stakes. They weren't ideal, but they would do. By the time I finished setting up, the sun had almost set. I lit a fire, cooked a quick dinner, and cracked open a beer. As the night settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was still too still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, like everything around you is waiting for something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was just the fact that I was here alone, but I didn't feel entirely comfortable. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames. The crackling of the wood was the only sound, and I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, but that was it. It was peaceful in a way, but also eerie. I decided to turn in early, figuring I'd get a good night's sleep and be up with the sun for a hike the next day. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the car one last time, and crawled into the tent. I zipped it up and settled into my sleeping bag, letting the sounds of the forest lull me to sleep. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard something, a faint noise from outside, almost like a twig snapping. It was so quiet that it could have been my imagination, but I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I listened harder. Another snap, the third. I turned the flashlight on, but there was nothing outside the tent. I shook my head. It was just the wind. I was being paranoid. I switched off the flashlight, rolled over, and tried to get some sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside my tent. This time, it wasn't the wind or animals. It was deliberate, a slow, steady rustling, like someone or something was moving around my campsite. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my chest. I wasn't used to being scared when camping, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I held my breath and listened. The rustling stopped for a moment, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and careful, moving around the tent. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to make a sound. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, listening for any sign that whatever it was still out there. The silence stretched on, and just as I started to convince myself it was nothing, the rustling came again, this time closer to the tent. It was like something was leaning against the side of it. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight. I didn't want to give whatever it was outside a reason to get any closer. I grabbed my flashlight again, flicking it on quickly. The The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No sign of whoever or whatever had been moving around. I waited a few more minutes before slowly letting out a breath. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe it had been something harmless. The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that it was nothing to worry about. After a few more minutes of listening, I finally relaxed and managed to fall back asleep. When morning came, I woke up feeling groggy, but I figured I'd gotten a solid few hours of sleep. The sun had barely risen, but I was already out of the tent, stretching and rubbing my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that the air was cool and still. The second thing was that 2 of my tent stakes were missing. I froze. I knew I had packed them. I distinctly remembered putting them in the bag before leaving. But now they were gone. I checked around the tent. There was no sign of them anywhere nearby. I must have looked for a good 5 minutes before I noticed something odd. About 20 feet away from my tent, both stakes were stuck upright in the ground. They were positioned perfectly, one next to the other, angled directly toward my tent, like someone had carefully placed them there. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the stakes. My stomach turned. The way they were placed so deliberately and precisely, it felt wrong. I walked over to them, my feet heavy, my mind racing. When I reached the stakes, I crouched down, inspecting them closely. They were exactly the way I had left them. No dirt on them, no sign that they had been moved recently. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Had I somehow misplaced them? Could I have dropped them without realizing it? No, I was sure I packed them. There was no way I had forgotten something like that. I looked around, the feeling of unease creeping back up my spine. The forest around me was still, almost unnervingly so. The birds weren't chirping. There was no breeze. It was as if the world had gone quiet again. I took the stakes and walked back to my tent, restaking the corners. My mind kept drifting back to the strange events of the night. The rustling, the footsteps, the way the stakes had been placed so carefully. I knew it didn't make sense, but something about it felt wrong. Too wrong to ignore. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I packed up quickly, more quickly than I usually would have. The hike I had planned was still on my mind, but the idea of being out there alone in that isolated spot felt like a bad idea. The morning's weirdness had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. By noon, I was packed up and on my way out of the woods. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror as I drove, glancing back at the empty forest. I didn't know who or what had been out there with me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. There was a lingering thought in the back of my mind, though. The kind that makes your heart beat faster when you're driving alone. The thought that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been imagining things. The forest around me might have been silent, but something was watching, waiting. And the weirdness of that morning, it wasn't something I could shake off easily. I didn't stop again until I hit town. By then, I had put as much distance between myself and that campsite as I could. But the memory of the stakes, and the way they had been arranged so carefully, still lingered. It was the kind of trip I had been looking forward to for a long time. I'd spent months planning it, gathering all the gear I needed, and finding the perfect spot deep in the forest. It wasn't a popular campground, and that's exactly why I chose it. I liked the solitude, the peace. I've always felt more comfortable alone in nature, away from the noise and chaos of city life. There was a small, hidden area near a creek, surrounded by tall pines, with only one trail leading to it. I figured if I was going to spend a weekend away, this was the place to be. I drove up the narrow, winding road that cut through the forest, the trees closing in around me as I got farther from civilization. The sound of my tires crunching on the gravel was the only noise, and as I approached the trailhead, I felt that familiar thrill. This was it, the kind of place where most people wouldn't even think to venture. A perfect spot for a solo camping trip. I parked my truck and began unloading my gear. I'd packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, and some food. The weather was perfect. Crisp air, clear sky, and no sign of rain. I should have appreciated the silence more at that moment, but I was eager to get set up and start relaxing. I started down the trail, my boots crunching the dry leaves beneath my feet. The forest was dense, and the trail was barely visible in some spots, overgrown with weeds and brush, but I didn't mind. It felt more like an adventure that way. The hike was short, only about half a mile, but the terrain was steep in places. As I walked, I passed towering trees, pines, oaks, and maples, each one casting long shadows in the afternoon light. The smell of the damp earth and pine needles filled my nose, and I had that sense of being far away from the world, like I was the only person left. There was no sign of anyone else around. No footprints, no abandoned trash, no trail markers, nothing. It was perfect. When I reached the spot I'd picked out, I immediately felt at home. The creek gurgled softly in the distance, and the ground was soft with a layer of moss. I set up my tent by the creek's edge and started preparing my camp. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting an orange glow over everything. As I got the fire going, I realized how alone I truly was. It was peaceful, but that peace also felt heavy, like something was just barely out of reach. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the natural solitude of camping alone. That night, after a simple meal of freeze-dried food and a cup of coffee, I sat by the fire. The stars were beginning to appear, twinkling through the gaps in the trees. The air had a crisp bite to it, and I wrapped myself in my jacket as I stared into the flames, letting my mind wander. I had the forest all to myself. There was no one else around for miles. It felt like I had the whole place to myself. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. It was a faint feeling, like someone was watching me. I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe I was just being paranoid. I reached for my flashlight and scanned the edge of the trees. Nothing. I shook my head and laughed at myself. It was just the woods playing tricks. It was normal to feel a little off when you were alone out here. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. Something wasn't quite right. I decided to call it a night, even though it was still early. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, trying to forget the strange feeling from earlier. The sound of the creek outside was soothing, and I closed my eyes, letting the sound lull me to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise, something soft, like a twig snapping or the rustle of leaves. My heart would race, and I'd lay there, frozen, listening, but hearing nothing more. I told myself it was just the wind or some animal passing through. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, a soft shuffling sound, followed by a low, grating scrape. It was so close, I felt my pulse jump in my throat. I lay still in the darkness, holding my breath, listening. There was something outside my tent. I could hear it moving slowly, deliberately, just at the edge of the firelight. It was too heavy to be an animal. Nothing out here would make a sound like that. And the movement wasn't like an animal either. It was too methodical, like someone walking around my tent, circling it. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on. I shone the beam out into the night, scanning the area. The light hit the trees, the rocks, and the shadows that stretched long across the ground. There was nothing there. The forest was still silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal, but something about it didn't sit right. I lay there for a long time, wide awake, listening to every crack and creak the forest made. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I convinced myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, but I shrugged it off. I went about my day, made breakfast, and took a walk along the creek. The sun was brighter now, and the forest was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the odd feeling stayed with me. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was still out there, watching from the shadows. I decided to take a longer hike that day, hoping the physical activity would help me clear my mind. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, grabbed my knife just in case, and headed out, leaving my tent and gear behind. The trail was quiet, but the further I went, the more uneasy I became. I felt like I was being followed. It was that same feeling again, the sensation that something was just behind me, moving in the same direction, but never quite showing itself. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, half expecting to see something or someone there, but there was nothing. The feeling intensified the deeper I went into the woods. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the air grew thicker. I couldn't stop myself from looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees around me. I was starting to get paranoid. I decided to turn back before I went too far. I retraced my steps, but as I neared the clearing where my camp was set up, I froze. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It wasn't clear at first, just a dark shape against the lighter background of the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out, but when I did, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too broad, and it didn't move, not even when I stood there staring at it for what felt like an eternity. It was just standing there, motionless, like it was waiting for something. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground, and my mind was racing, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It just stood there, unmoving. I could feel my palms starting to sweat as I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on it. Then, without warning, it vanished. The figure simply disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing behind. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned around and ran back toward my camp as fast as I could. I didn't stop to breathe, didn't look back. My heart was pounding, and my head was spinning, but I kept running, driven by pure adrenaline. When I reached my tent, I didn't even think. I grabbed my stuff, packed it all up in a panic, and hurriedly made my way back to my truck. I didn't stop, didn't take a breath until I was safely in my vehicle, the doors locked, and the engine running. I didn't care about the hike anymore. I didn't care about the peacefulness or the solitude. I just needed to get out of there, to leave that forest behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but trees. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, or if I had imagined it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. I never did. I haven't been back to that spot, and I don't think I ever will. There are places in the woods, deep in the forest, where things happen that you don't understand. But you don't need to understand them to know that you should leave them alone. I never went camping alone in that area again, and I never will. Camping in the Ozarks had always been something I wanted to do. I'd seen the pictures: steep forested hills, fog curling over the trees in the early morning, rivers cutting through thick woods, and long, lonely trails that went on for miles without seeing a soul. It felt like a place that could swallow you up and keep you hidden from the rest of the world. That idea didn't scare me. If anything, it was what drew me there. I'd taken a few days off work, packed my gear, and made the drive into Arkansas alone. I was planning on doing some solo backpacking and setting up camp in a remote spot I'd found through a forum. Nothing official, just a clearing a couple of miles off one of the lesser-used trails. I didn't see anyone on my way in. Not on the road, not at the trailhead. It was early fall, and the leaves were just starting to turn. The sun was warm, the air cool, and the forest smelled like damp earth and pine. Felt perfect. I hiked in about 3 hours before finding the spot. A flat patch of land tucked between a ridge and a dry creek bed. The trees were tall and close, but not too dense. I set up my tent near a big oak tree and built a small fire pit with rocks. I gathered some fallen branches, got a small fire going, and cooked up a quick meal. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear every little movement in the woods. Birds, squirrels, the occasional snap of a branch far off, but nothing that felt out of the ordinary. As the sun dropped behind the hills, I got settled in. I'd brought a book, and after eating, I sat by the fire and read until it got too dark. The firelight bounced off the trunks of the nearby trees, making the forest around me feel smaller, like the light was holding it back. I could only see about 20 feet in any direction. Beyond that was just black. I put out the fire before turning in. I always try to leave as little trace as possible when I camp. Inside the tent, I zipped up, laid back in my sleeping bag, and listened to the forest. It was around midnight, I think, when I heard the scream. It wasn't an animal. I've heard foxes scream before, and bobcats, and even elk bugling in the distance. This was different. It was short, sharp, and high-pitched like a person in pure panic. Came from somewhere down in the valley. The sound echoed, long and loud, but there was something strange about it. It didn't fade the way normal sound does. It just stopped all at once, like someone cut a wire. I froze. I didn't sit up, didn't move, just lay there listening. The woods were dead silent. Not even the usual rustle of leaves or distant crack of branches. Just the faint ringing in my ears and my heartbeat picking up. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. I started telling myself it was some strange bird call I didn't know. Maybe something far away, distorted by the way the valley carried sound. The air was getting cold. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter. Then it came again. Same scream, same length, same pitch, same cutoff at the end. But it was closer. Still not right outside my tent, but definitely up the valley now. Maybe a few hundred yards. The sound was the same as before, like it hadn't changed at all. Not louder, not softer, just there. Exactly the same. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for my light. I didn't want to make a sound. My brain was running through everything I knew about local wildlife, people, echo patterns, anything that could make this make sense. But nothing added up. Another 10 minutes passed. Then the scream came again. Closer. Still the exact same volume. Still with that unnatural cutoff, like someone pressing stop on a recording. No change in emotion, no difference in distance. Now I was sweating, even though the air had dropped into the 40s. My hands were clammy, my face felt cold, and my legs were shaking under the sleeping bag. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear brush moving. Nothing but that scream every few minutes. I stayed like that, wide awake, for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. I just waited, breath held, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening for the next scream. But it never came again. The sky started to lighten around 5 in the morning. The birds came back, slowly at first, just a chirp or two, then more until it sounded like a normal forest again. I unzipped the tent a few inches and looked out. Everything looked normal. The fire pit, my pack, the trees. No sign of anything or anyone. I crawled out slowly, legs stiff, back sore from lying so still. I stretched and looked around. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A trail camera, strapped to a tree, maybe 30 feet from my tent, facing directly at it. It wasn't mine. I didn't bring one. I walked over and looked at it. It was one of those camouflaged models you can buy at any outdoor store. The kind hunters use to track deer or game. It was mounted about chest high, angled slightly down toward my tent. It looked new. No rust, no wear. And the bark it was strapped to had marks on it, like someone had cinched it down recently. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. Then I looked around at the trees nearby. There weren't any others that I could see, just the one directly aimed at me. I thought about taking it down, but I didn't want to touch it. Something about it felt wrong. Not illegal, maybe people do set up cameras on public land, but strange. Why here? Why my camp? I hadn't seen anyone on my way in. No parked cars, no other hikers. The place was off the beaten path, on an unmarked trail. You'd have to know it was here. You'd have to be looking. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't cook breakfast, didn't even refill my water bottles. I just tore down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and started walking. The trail felt different on the way back. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me freeze. A woodpecker tapping on a tree. A breeze pushing leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not the kind of paranoia you get from being alone in the woods, either. This was sharper, heavier, like something was behind me, just out of sight. Halfway back to my car, I found something else. A pile of stones off to the side of the trail, maybe 20 feet off. I almost missed it. They were small, maybe the size of a fist, stacked about knee-high. At first, I thought it was just a cairn. People build them sometimes to mark trails or as little art pieces. But this one was different. There were items tucked in between the stones. A piece of cloth, faded red. A rusted spoon. A Polaroid photo, water-damaged and curled at the edges, but I could still see part of it. The corner of a tent. Trees behind it. A person's foot, half cut off by the frame. No face. I didn't touch any of it. Just looked for a moment, then kept walking. I made it back to the car just before noon. I didn't see a single person on the way. No fresh boot prints. No broken branches that hadn't already been there. I drove straight out of the mountains. I didn't stop until I hit a town with a diner. I went in, ordered a coffee, and sat there for a long time, trying to settle my nerves. I didn't tell the waitress anything. I didn't call the police. What would I have said? I heard a weird scream and saw a trail cam. I wasn't even sure I hadn't imagined it by then. No proof. No real evidence. Just a camera and some rocks and a scream that still played in my head like it was on loop. That night, in a hotel room 2 towns over, I looked up trail camera brands. I wanted to know how long the batteries lasted, how much footage they could store. Most could go for months. Some were motion activated. Some had Wi-Fi, some didn't. The more I read, the worse I felt. Anyone could buy one. Anyone could put one up. You wouldn't even know it was there unless you stumbled on it. For the next few weeks, I kept thinking about that scream. How it never changed. How it got closer but didn't get louder. Like it was being played from a speaker. Like someone had planted it in the woods, maybe to scare people, maybe for some other reason I couldn't understand. I went back through the forum I'd found the camp spot on. The post had been deleted. The user who posted it had no other activity. I searched through other posts, looking for anything similar. I didn't find anything. A few months later, I read an article about missing hikers in the Ozarks. Not a big one, just a couple of paragraphs buried in the local section of an Arkansas newspaper. A man in his 40s, last seen heading into the forest alone. No sign of him. They found his car at the trailhead. Nothing else. They never mentioned a scream. Never mentioned a camera. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't find it. I haven't been back since. I still hike, still camp, but I stay on marked trails now. Official campgrounds. Places where I know someone will walk by every few hours. I still think about going back. Sometimes I feel like I need to figure out what really happened. But I don't. I let it sit there like that trail cam, like that pile of rocks, out in the woods waiting. It was late October when I drove out into the Nevada desert to get away for a few days. I'd been dealing with too much noise. Work, traffic, people, and I needed silence. The kind of silence you only get when you're miles from anything and anyone. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I was just looking for a place off the grid, far from any campgrounds or marked trails. I wanted to feel small again, surrounded by open land and big sky. I found a spot late in the afternoon, maybe 100 feet off a dry, rocky service road that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. The terrain was rugged and bare, the earth packed hard and cracked in places. The ridges around me rose like waves frozen in time, casting long shadows as the sun dropped lower. It was quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the buzz of insects, just the dull hum of my truck cooling down after I parked. I set up my small 2-person tent facing east so I could catch the sunrise in the morning. I rolled out my sleeping pad and bag inside, laid my backpack in the corner, and placed my boots just outside. I gathered some rocks to ring a small fire pit and used my camp stove to boil water for dinner. By dusk, the only light around was from my campfire and the fading pink sky. It felt like I was the only person in the world. After dinner, I sat by the fire, sipping lukewarm coffee from a tin cup. The stars came out one by one, then in clusters until the sky was full of them. No light pollution out here, just space and stars. That's when I noticed something. A flicker of orange light far off to my west, across 2 ridges. It was faint, but clearly a campfire. It wasn't there earlier. I was sure of that. I reached into my pack and grabbed my binoculars. I braced my elbows on my knees to steady them and focused in. I could just make out the flame, not big but steady. A little closer to the fire, I saw a figure. Human, sitting upright, still. I figured maybe it was another solo camper, someone like me trying to find peace in the desert. But what struck me right away was how still they were. No shifting, no movement, not even a hand going up to scratch a face or poke the fire. Just sitting. I watched them for 20 minutes. They never moved. After a while, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe they were just tired. Maybe they were meditating or something. People come out here to clear their heads, and I'm not one to judge. But I kept checking on them every 15 or 20 minutes. Always the same. Same spot, same posture. Like they were watching their fire without really watching it. It was unsettling, but I told myself I was just letting my imagination take over. Too much quiet can do that to you. At around 1 a.m., I looked through the binoculars again, and the fire was gone. No glow, no smoke, no trace of light. Just pitch black where the person had been. It was sudden. No fading embers or dimming. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. That's when I started to feel really uncomfortable. I put the binoculars away and zipped up the tent. I'd left the fire to burn down on its own. Just a few red coals left. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to listen to the silence. It had been peaceful earlier, but now it felt heavier. Like the dark had a weight to it. Every small sound, distant clicks, the faint shift of the cooling rocks, felt louder. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were slow, measured, crunching the gravel and loose rock outside my tent. The sound came from the direction of the ridgeline where I'd seen the fire. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet, but they weren't stomping either. Just slow, careful steps. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved closer. Then they stopped. Then I heard a few more, circling to the side of the tent. Then behind it. Then they stopped again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the roof of my tent and waited. I didn't have a weapon, just a camping knife buried somewhere in my pack. But it wouldn't have mattered. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I didn't want to make a sound. Something in my gut told me that would be the worst thing I could do. The footsteps continued to circle. They crunched across the gravel in a slow, deliberate path, like whoever it was studying the tent. Listening, I could hear the weight in each step. Not an animal, not a coyote or a deer. These were human steps. I stayed completely still for what felt like an hour. The footsteps would stop for long stretches, then resume. Each time they started again, they were closer to the door. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the mesh window, just for a second. No flashlight, no noise, just a shape. Then it was gone. The steps eventually faded away. I never heard them walk off completely. They just seemed to stop, as if the person had vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep. I didn't move until the sun started to rise. I waited for the light to push the shadows back and for the ground outside to come into view. When it was finally bright enough, I slowly unzipped the tent and looked around. There were no footprints. The gravel didn't hold prints well, but still, I expected to see at least some kind of disturbance. But the ground looked just as it had the day before. I stood up, stretching my stiff legs, and that's when I saw it. Right outside the tent door, maybe 2 feet away, someone had stacked a small stone cairn. 5 flat stones, carefully balanced. No note, no markings, nothing else. Just the stones. I hadn't done that, and there weren't any other rocks like that nearby. These were smoother, rounded, almost like river stones. Someone had brought them there, placed them one by one, quietly, while I was lying frozen inside the tent. I didn't pack up right away. I stood there staring at that little pile of rocks, feeling the weight of it settle in. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was meant for me to find. It wasn't a prank. No one knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone the exact location, just a general area on the map. No cell service. No one else had passed me on the way in. It would have taken hours of hiking off-trail to get to where I camped. The cairn wasn't big or threatening, but it felt like a message. A sign that someone had been there, watching, close enough to walk right up to my tent in the middle of the night. I left it alone. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I packed up everything as quickly as I could, rolled up my sleeping bag, tore down the tent, stuffed it all into the truck, and got out of there. The sun was still low, and the air was cold. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Even now, months later, I think about that night. Not because something attacked me or chased me, but because nothing did. The silence, the stillness, the feeling of being studied, the sound of slow, careful steps in the dark. And that cairn, whoever it was, didn't want to be seen. They didn't try to break in. They didn't speak. They didn't leave tracks. But they got close, real close, and they wanted me to know it. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone in a place that remote. I still hike, still get outside, but I stick to areas where I can see other people, where there's noise, signs of life, because silence in the desert isn't always empty. Sometimes something's listening, watching, and sometimes it leaves a stone at your door. We'd been planning the winter trip for a while. It was one of those ideas that started over beers, talking about how soft people get when they don't test themselves. The idea of camping out in the deep cold, away from everything, with no noise but the wind and the crack of frozen trees. It sounded good. Hard but good. We picked a spot out near a frozen lake in the woods, a full day's snowshoe hike from the nearest road. The plan was to hike in, set up camp for 2 nights, and hike out. Simple. We left early in the morning. Snow coming down steady but soft, just flakes drifting through the trees. It was cold, real cold. The kind that makes your eyelashes freeze and your breath feel like smoke. But we had good gear. We were ready, or so we thought. The first day went fine. We made good time even with the snowshoes, cutting through the forest slowly but surely. The snow was knee-deep in places, fresh and untouched. Not a single other track around. Just us and the wilderness. By the time we found a decent clearing near the lake's edge, it was late afternoon. We set up the tent, cooked over a small camp stove, and watched the last bit of daylight disappear behind the trees. That first night, it was cold, but manageable. We huddled deep in our sleeping bags, layered up, and let the wind put us to sleep. The second day, the weather turned. The wind picked up and it started snowing hard, the kind of snow that blows sideways and finds its way into every crack. We stayed close to camp, mostly tucked in our tent or pacing to stay warm. We were planning to tough it out, but as the sun started to drop, the temperature went with it. Fast. We'd both done cold weather trips before, but this was different. The wind chill dropped below -30, easy. Our breath started freezing the inside of the tent. Water bottles turned solid in minutes. I could feel it in my hands, even with gloves on. It was the kind of cold that didn't just make you uncomfortable, it scared you. We both knew we couldn't spend another night in the tent. That's when we remembered the cabin. We'd passed it about a mile back on the way in. Old and half covered in snow, but still standing. It looked abandoned, hadn't been used in years, but it was shelter. For walls, a roof, maybe even a stove inside. It didn't feel right at the time to use it, but now it felt like survival. We packed our things and headed back through the woods, following our old snowshoe tracks. The snow had started to cover them, but we found the cabin again, standing like a black shape among the trees. The front door was swollen shut. We had to shoulder it open, both of us pushing hard, until the old wood creaked and gave way. Inside, it was dark and smelled like dust and mold. Everything was frozen solid, but it was better than the wind. A single room, no furniture except a few broken chairs and a collapsed table. There was an old stone stove in the corner, the kind you feed with firewood. We swept snow off the floor and got out our sleeping pads and bags. We checked the place over for any openings before shutting the door again. There was no lock, so we dragged a beam from the broken table across it and wedged it tight. Then we used cord and some carabiners to rig a makeshift latch from the inside. Not perfect, but enough to make us feel safe. We didn't bother with a fire. The flue in the stove was clogged with snow and who knows what else. We just layered up, got into our bags, and tried to sleep. The wind howled all night, rattling the wood, shaking the beams. But inside, it was quiet, still cold, but not deadly. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Sometime deep in the night. It was dark inside the cabin. The only light a pale glow through the frost-covered window. I lay still, not sure why I'd woken up. Then I heard it. The soft sound of metal moving. A slow, deliberate click and turn. The door handle. I thought maybe it was the wind, but then it happened again. The handle twisted, held there, like someone was slowly trying to open the door. My breath caught in my throat. I turned toward my friend. He was already awake, his eyes wide in the dark. We didn't say a word. We just stared at the door. The wood creaked slightly, like there was weight leaning on it. The handle turned again. Slow, patient, steady. Not yanked or jiggled, just turned. Someone was out there, standing still in the snow, trying to open the door. I sat up slowly, barely breathing. My heart thudded in my ears. I couldn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind outside and the sound of that old metal handle shifting. Then it stopped. We waited. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. We didn't move for what felt like forever. I kept thinking maybe it had been the wind. Maybe the old latch was loose. Maybe it was creaking from the cold. But no, it wasn't the wind. That was something trying to open the door. Slowly, quietly, and now it was gone. We didn't talk, just got up, still in our long underwear and jackets, grabbed our boots and gear. We didn't dare open the door. Instead, we went to the side window. It had been boarded up long ago, but the boards were rotted and soft. We broke through them with the handle of a snow shovel, kicked the old glass out and climbed through, boots half on. Outside, the wind hit us like a wall, but we didn't stop. We climbed down into the snow, pulled our packs through, and moved away from the cabin without looking back. We stopped about 30 yards out, crouched behind a tree, and waited, watching. Nothing. No lights, no movement, no sounds. Just the wind in the trees and snow swirling through the night. When the sun came up, we went back. We needed answers. We needed to see. If someone had come in the night, there'd be tracks. The snow had been coming down light but steady. Any prints would still be fresh. We circled the cabin from a distance, moving slow, scanning the ground. There were no tracks. None. Not one. Except ours. Leading in the night before and then out from the window. We walked the whole perimeter twice. Looked for signs of animals. Nothing. Not even bird tracks. Just snow. Untouched. Still powdery on top. We stood there for a long time, not saying anything. Eventually, we went back in through the window. The door was still latched, still wedged shut. The handle was turned slightly, like it had been twisted and left there. But the door never opened. There were no scratches, no dents, no signs of someone trying to force it. We packed our things, left the cabin, and didn't stop walking until we hit the car. On the drive back, neither of us spoke much. We didn't have answers, just questions that didn't make sense. Who tries to open the door of a locked, rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm? Why no tracks? Why no sound? It was like someone had been out there, or something, but that makes no sense. Couldn't have been real, but we both heard it. I've thought about that night a lot since then. Ran it over and over in my head. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in anything supernatural. But something real happened out there. Something that doesn't fit. Maybe it was someone watching us. Maybe they followed our tracks and wanted in. Maybe they were smart enough to walk in our prints and back out again to cover their trail. But even then, why not say something? Why just stand there in the dark and try the handle like that? We reported it when we got home. Called the local rangers, told them what happened. They sent someone to check the cabin a few days later. Said there were no signs of anyone around. No trash, no fire, no new prints. Just a broken window, some disturbed snow, and an old cabin falling in on itself. We haven't been back since. I still camp, still go deep into the woods, but I don't take shelter in old cabins anymore. I'd rather take my chances in the cold, because whatever that was that night, whatever stood outside our door, it didn't want in just to get warm. It was patient, calm. It didn't make noise, didn't knock, didn't shout. It just turned the handle, slow and quiet, like it had all the time in the world. And that's the part one still can't shake. The patience, the silence, like it was used to waiting. Maybe it had waited there before. Maybe it still is. We had driven for nearly 6 hours from Boise, pushing deep into the forested backcountry of central Idaho. No cell service, no marked trails, no campsites. That was the idea. Get off-grid, away from work, away from noise, and away from people. There were 5 of us, me, Jared, Luke, Brian, and Matt. We were all in our late 20s. Most of us had grown up hiking and camping, and all of us wanted something that felt like a real escape. We had picked a patch of land marked only by Forest Service roads on an old paper map Jared brought along. He had circled the area in red weeks earlier, said it looked promising, ridges, water access, and absolutely no development for miles. Sounded perfect. We parked our trucks near a washout where the road gave up trying to stay level. From there, we packed up and hiked about 4 miles through thick, uneven forest. The kind of place where the trees grow close together and block out half the sky, and where fallen logs rot in place for so long they just sink into the ground. It felt like no one had been through there in years. We found a small clearing about the size of a backyard, flat and tucked just above a creek. It was silent except for the water, and even that seemed to hush once the sun started dropping. We set up tents, collected firewood, and cooked dinner while the light faded through the trees. That first night was uneventful, cold, quiet, a little unnerving, just because of how empty everything felt. The next morning, we hiked down the creek for water. Luke and Brian brought out their fly rods and fished for a couple of hours while the rest of us lounged around camp or wandered into the brush looking for dry kindling. We were just killing time, really. Nobody had brought any plans or goals for the trip. It was supposed to be mindless and relaxing, the kind of trip where you sit around and bullshit until someone falls asleep in their chair. It was that second night when we heard it. We were sitting around the fire, no music, no talking at that moment. Just the sound of the flames popping. Then, somewhere out past the tree line, maybe 100 yards out, we heard it. A voice. High-pitched, cracking, definitely a kid's voice. It just said, "Help me." That's it. Clear as day. One sentence. Stopped us cold. All 5 of us just froze in place, staring into the dark like we could somehow see through it. Came again maybe 20 seconds later. "Help me." Same voice, same tone. No panic in it, but no playfulness either. Just weird. Jared stood up, looking out past the firelight. I could tell he was trying to figure out if one of us had set it up somehow. Nobody moved. None of us said anything. We just sat there. Brian let out this nervous laugh, like maybe it was a prank someone was pulling on us. But who the hell would be out there pulling that kind of prank miles from the nearest road, in the middle of nowhere? And even if it was someone, it didn't make sense. There were no cars on the road when we pulled in. We hadn't passed anyone on the hike in, and the trail was hard enough to follow in the daylight. Nobody was just stumbling up here by accident in the dark. Jared finally said we should check it out, that if someone really needed help, we couldn't just ignore it. So we grabbed a couple of flashlights and walked toward the sound. The forest closed in quick. Even with the beams cutting through the dark, the trees made it feel like we were walking through tunnels. Every few feet, a branch would scrape the side of my arm or a pine needle would catch in my jacket. We walked in silence, listening for the voice again, but it didn't come back. We didn't go far, maybe 100 yards, give or take, before we stopped. None of us wanted to say it, but we were scared. It wasn't just the voice. It was the feeling that came with it, like we'd stepped into someplace we weren't supposed to be. The forest out there didn't feel right. The air was heavy, still. No wind, no animal sounds. Even the creek behind us had gone quiet. Then I saw it, right near the base of a tree, half covered in dead leaves and pine needles. Something fabric. I called the others over and knelt down. It was a small backpack, faded, rotting, the zippers rusted and stuck in place. The straps looked like they'd been chewed or torn. There was moss growing along one side, and when I lifted it, the bottom half crumbled apart like paper. Inside, I found what looked like an old-school folder, mostly eaten away, and a child-sized sock that had turned brown with dirt and age. No names, no tags, nothing that told us who it had belonged to. We all just stared at it. Nobody spoke, not a single word. I saw Jared slowly step back and turn toward camp. The rest of us followed. We didn't talk. We didn't stop. We packed our gear in dead silence. Headlamps on, tents torn down in minutes. No arguments, no planning. Just a quiet, mutual understanding that we weren't staying there another night. We hiked out in the dark with only the sound of our breathing and boots crunching leaves. Took us almost double the time to get back to the trucks. Every branch that cracked made us jump. Every shift in the shadows made us look over our shoulders. I kept thinking I'd hear the voice again, but it never came. We reached the trucks around 3 in the morning, tossed our gear into the beds, and drove until we hit cell service. We didn't even discuss where we were going. We just kept moving. We stayed at a motel in a small town near the edge of the forest. Nobody said much. We each took showers, watched TV, and went to sleep. The next day, we drove home. Still, no one brought it up. Not in the truck. Not over food. Not after we got back to our places. And in the years since, we've never really talked about that trip. I've thought about reporting the backpack, but I don't even know what I'd say. There was no name, no body, no proof of anything. Just a child's voice in the woods and a rotting pack buried under leaves. I don't know how long it had been there. Could have been 5 years. Could have been 20. What sticks with me isn't the voice. It's that feeling when we found the backpack. Like we had stepped into someone else's tragedy, uninvited and unprepared. Like the forest didn't want us there. I've been camping a dozen times since, in different states, even different countries. But I've never gone back to Idaho. Not to that forest. I probably never will. And the others? We're still friends. We text. We meet up sometimes. But that trip is a blank space in all our conversations. Nobody asks. Nobody wants to remember. We all heard it. We all saw it. But pretending it didn't happen makes it easier to sleep. I don't believe in ghosts. I never did. But I believe in silence. In places too quiet for comfort. In voices where they shouldn't be. And I believe that sometimes the woods keep their stories buried, just deep enough that you might brush up against them if you're not careful. I had been planning the solo trip for months. I picked the Ouachita Mountains for a reason. Less foot traffic than the Ozarks, quiet trails, long stretches without seeing anyone. I wanted the isolation. I was trying to get away from noise, from people, from all the mess back home. My job had been eating me alive. The city was wearing me down. And I figured the only cure was a few days alone in the woods. Just me, my pack, a map, and the endless trail. I started out early on a Wednesday morning. Parked my truck at a remote trailhead outside Mena, Arkansas, locked it up, slung my pack, and started heading west into the deeper parts of the range. I had a loop planned that would take me through some of the less maintained trails, with 2 nights planned out in the backcountry and a third depending on weather. The forecast was clear, the air was cool and dry, and the trees were still thick with early fall leaves, mostly green but tinged with yellow. It should have been perfect, but about halfway through that first day, I noticed something strange. I hadn't seen a single squirrel. No birds flitting from branch to branch. No woodpeckers hammering trunks. Not even the usual hum of flies or gnats around my face when I stopped for water. The forest was quiet. And not just peaceful quiet. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain, like they're trying to find something that should be there but isn't. I chalked it up to the time of day or the time of year. Maybe I was lucky. No bugs, no racket. Just silence. I told myself that was a good thing. By the time I made camp that night, I had a little twinge in the back of my head. Something like a headache, but not quite. Just a feeling that something wasn't sitting right. But I set up like normal. Pitched my tent on a slight rise, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be seen, but close enough to get my bearings in the morning. I boiled some water for my freeze-dried meal, ate while sitting on a fallen log, and watched the last light sink behind the tree line. That night, the silence got worse. I laid in my sleeping bag with my headlamp off, just listening. Normally, in the woods, you hear things even when you're trying not to. A distant owl, a rustle of leaves from some tiny creature, wind brushing the canopy, something, anything. But there was nothing, not even the faint sound of my own breath. My ears started to ring from the pressure of it, like when you're deep underwater or in a soundproof room. I turned from side to side, trying to get comfortable, trying to distract myself with thoughts of home, of work, of anything. But that silence, it had weight to it, pressed in. I kept thinking, if something moved out there, I'd hear it. Even if it was a mile away, I'd hear it. That should have made me feel safe. Didn't. The next day, I pushed deeper. I passed a few old blazes on trees, but they were faded and weathered. The trail had become more overgrown, harder to follow, but my map lined up and I had GPS as a backup. Still, the silence followed me. No animals, no signs of them. Even the usual deer tracks or rabbit droppings I might have expected were missing. The ground was just leaf litter and dry earth, untouched. I stopped a few times and just listened, thinking maybe I'd catch something, a bird call, a branch creaking. Nothing. I didn't see a single other person. Not a boot print, not a cut log, not a scrap of litter. Just woods, endless woods, and that pressure behind my ears, that feeling like something was just out of sight. By the second night, I felt off. It was the only word I could think of. Not sick, not scared, just wrong. Like I was someplace I shouldn't be. I made camp earlier, wanting more daylight to settle in. I set my tent near a dry creek bed, tucked it between some boulders for shelter, and made sure everything was squared away. Hung my food in a bag 30 yards off with plenty of paracord and did a sweep of the area just to be safe. I laid in my tent again, eyes open, listening. This time I was wide awake. At some point in the night, I started feeling like I wasn't alone. No sounds, no movement, just that feeling. The kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, the kind that tightens your chest a little. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter, kept my head on a swivel even though I couldn't see anything beyond the dim outline of the tent walls. I told myself I was just spooked by the quiet, that my brain was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine. It was slow, deep, heavy, just on the other side of the tent wall. Not moving, not sniffing or panting like an animal, just breathing, like someone standing still, controlling it. I couldn't see a shape through the nylon, couldn't make out any shadow, but it was close, inches away. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I didn't even blink. My heart was hammering, but I held my breath. I stayed like that for, I don't know how long. Could have been a minute, it could have been 20. The breathing just kept going, slow and steady, like the person or whatever it was knew I was in there and didn't care, or was waiting. Then it stopped, just like that. One breath and gone. I waited until dawn. I didn't sleep, not a second. My fingers were clenched around my knife the whole time. I didn't unzip the door, didn't check anything. I just laid there and listened to nothing. When the sky started to lighten, I slowly sat up, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and peeked out. Nothing, just trees, rocks, still no sounds. I stepped out and looked around, did a slow circle trying to see if there were tracks. There weren't. The ground was covered in dry leaves and I figured I'd see something disturbed. Nothing. No impressions, no scuffed dirt. But then I saw it. Right there, caught on the small metal pull of my rainfly zipper, was a long human hair. It was black, longer than any of mine, and it was looped around the zipper like it had gotten snagged when someone leaned in close. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. I packed my stuff fast. Didn't eat, didn't drink, just broke down camp and threw everything into my pack. I skipped the loop and took the most direct line back to the trailhead, cross-checking my map every 10 minutes, making sure I was going the right way. I didn't stop for water or rest until I was less than a mile from the road. Even then, I felt like I was being watched. The silence stayed with me almost the whole way. Just past the halfway point back, I finally started to hear birds again. A single crow cawed in the distance. I almost cried when I heard it. Then a few bugs, a rustling in some brush. The pressure in my ears let up. Felt like I'd passed out of something, like I'd crossed a line that had been invisible. When I got back to my truck, I checked the back seat before I even unlocked the door. Then I got in, locked it, and just sat there for a while, staring at the trailhead. There was no one else around, not a soul. It was like I'd stepped into some dead part of the forest and barely made it back out. I didn't report anything. Who would I tell? There was no crime, no evidence, just a hair and a feeling that something had come close. Close enough to breathe right outside my tent. Close enough to leave something behind. Close enough to know I was there and alone. I haven't been back to the Washita since, and I don't think I will. Sometimes I dream about that night. The silence, the breathing, the way it didn't move, didn't try to get in, didn't speak. Just stood there, watching. I still have the hair. I wrapped it in a tissue and slid it into a Ziploc when I got home. It sits in the back of my gear drawer. I haven't opened it since. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe to remind myself that it was real, that I wasn't imagining things. Because it was real. Something was out there, and it was human.